I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had faced family scandals, constitutional pressure, and private grief before, but nothing prepared him for the document placed before him that morning. Bearing Prince Philip's authority and preserved under strict instructions, the decree carried one devastating command. Camilla was to be excluded from every formal state event covered by its terms. Charles read the final paragraph twice. Then he stopped speaking. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept his eyes on the pages as the meaning settled in. The sealed decree, a formal written order kept closed until specific conditions were met, did not remove Camilla from ordinary royal appearances or charitable work. It targeted state events, the highest official ceremonies connected directly to the crown and its constitutional role. That distinction made the order more painful because these occasions publicly showed who stood closest to sovereign authority. The king reached for a pen, held it above the desk, then slowly set it down. An aide watched his expression harden. Philip was gone, yet his instruction had survived him, preserved as more than a private opinion and tied to ceremonial precedent, the established pattern used to guide major royal occasions. Charles understood why that mattered. Ignoring the document could turn a family dispute into a challenge over whether royal rules still meant anything when they became personally inconvenient. Camilla received the news in private and stared at him in disbelief. Her shock quickly sharpened into wounded anger. "Do you intend to obey it?" she asked. Charles did not answer at once. The queen consort had spent years building a place beside him, and now a decision written before his reign threatened to strip her from the ceremonies that most clearly represented his position as monarch. Charles turned to the second page and felt the pressure deepen. Philip had anticipated that someone might try to override the instruction. The wording connected the restriction to a narrow category of state protocol, the rules governing royal ceremony, rather than to personal preference. That meant affection alone could not dissolve it without consequences. The final shock came moments later. Only a handful of figures knew the sealed instruction existed, yet someone had chosen now to bring it forward. Charles asked who else had been briefed. The answer changed the room instantly. William already knew. The prince had read the same decree, but his reaction was not outrage. Charles could still fight it, but first he had to discover whether those closest to him would stand beside him, or enforce Philip's final boundary against him. The decree did more than remove Camilla from ceremonies. It struck directly at the fragile line Charles had spent years trying to erase, the line between the woman he loved and the institution he inherited. For him, this was painfully personal. For William, it was constitutional. And for Camilla, the message felt brutal. After everything she had survived, the palace was once again deciding where she belonged. Camilla kept returning to the same question, because nothing else mattered as much. Did Charles truly believe she had earned her place beside him? The king hesitated, and that small pause hurt more than an argument. He did believe in her. He had defended her for years. But the decree now lying between them was no longer simply a private judgment from Philip. It had been tied to the crown's most sensitive duties, where personal loyalty could not automatically decide who carried ceremonial authority. Charles tried to reassure her, but the words felt weaker than usual. Philip's legacy inside the family had always been complicated. Fiercely protective of the monarchy, deeply aware of rank, and willing to put continuity above comfort when he believed the institution was at risk. The late Duke had spent decades beside the sovereign, and that experience shaped how seriously he treated hierarchy. For the king, that made the situation even more painful. His father had not merely questioned Camilla. He had created a boundary intended to survive him. William felt the same pressure from the opposite direction. Alone before meeting his father, he changed the first sentence he planned to say again and again. He knew defending Philip's instruction could sound like a personal rejection of the queen consort, and he did not want that fight. Yet the prince had also seen something Charles had not fully examined: an attached memorandum, a written explanation, preserved with the decree to record why the restriction had been created. The future king read the memorandum carefully. Philip feared that expanding Camilla's role at the most constitutionally sensitive ceremonies could slowly turn personal inclusion into permanent precedent. A precedent meant an earlier decision that future royal households might feel expected to follow. That was the danger Philip had tried to contain. Once a ceremonial position became normal, reversing it later could create an even greater crisis. Camilla then learned something that stripped away her last hope of dismissing the decree as anger. Philip had reviewed it. He had revised the language. He had preserved it deliberately. The queen consort went quiet when Charles told her. Whatever she thought of his father's judgment, this had not been written in one bitter moment. Then William noticed the date attached to Philip's memorandum. It pointed back to one ceremony years earlier. And to understand why Philip had gone this far, the family would have to reopen the moment they had buried, the incident that had changed his mind permanently. The secret decree did not begin with legal language or palace procedure. It began with one ceremony, one private exchange, and one decision that Prince Philip never forgot. Years before the document surfaced, a disagreement over Camilla's position at a major state occasion had erupted behind closed doors. What looked insignificant to everyone else became, for Philip, the moment when a future constitutional problem stopped being theoretical. Philip had always drawn a hard line between family appearances and formal state functions. The latter were ceremonies carried out in the name of the crown, where position, order, and precedence carried constitutional meaning beyond ordinary family life. To him, changing one place in a procession could create an expectation that survived for years. Smaller disagreements had already worried him, but one event finally convinced him that assumption could become precedent if nobody stopped it. Camilla challenged that boundary during preparations for a Commonwealth state reception. The ceremony was designed to bring senior royals and Commonwealth representatives together under a fixed order of precedence, meaning each person's place reflected an established institutional role. She privately questioned why the seating and procession plan placed her behind working royals whose duties carried defined constitutional weight. Philip listened, then refused to change it. The queen consort pushed again, insisting that standing beside Charles should count for something. His answer remained firm. Charles heard about the exchange and confronted his father soon afterward. He found Philip alone in a private corridor and demanded to know why Camilla had been treated as though her place beside him could simply be ignored. The older man did not raise his voice. He told his son that protecting someone emotionally was one thing, but changing the meaning of state protocol was another. The king-to-be walked away furious, convinced his father had turned ceremony into a personal rejection. Philip did not forget that confrontation. That evening, he dictated a private note to a trusted secretary, creating a documented account of what had happened and why it disturbed him. He warned that a future sovereign might one day feel pressured to blur ceremonial boundaries out of loyalty to someone he loved. That warning mattered because once an exception became normal, future households could treat it as an inherited right. The note eventually became the foundation of the sealed decree. Philip revised the language, connected it to the same disputed expansion of ceremonial authority, and ordered it preserved unless those exact conditions returned. Now Charles understood the cruel precision of it. His father had not written for the past. He had written for a future king facing exactly this choice. And when William entered to discuss what happened next, father and son were no longer arguing about history. They were about to fight over obedience. When the door closed, there were no advisors, no secretaries, and no carefully prepared palace phrases to soften what followed. Charles faced William not merely as king and heir, but as a father who believed his own son was about to defend a dead man's restriction against the woman beside him. William knew exactly how painful his position would sound. He defended it anyway. Charles pushed the decree across the table and asked whether his son truly expected him to humiliate Camilla in public. The king wanted one narrow interpretation that would allow her to remain beside him at the state occasions now under dispute. These were not ordinary royal engagements, such as charity visits or public appearances. They were formal state events, ceremonies directly tied to the crown's official authority, where every position and role carried symbolic weight. William looked at the pages, but did not touch them. The prince chose his answer carefully. Enforcing a boundary, he said, was not the same as humiliating someone. Charles immediately accused him of hiding behind Philip's memory because it was easier than confronting the pain this decision would cause. William's controlled expression finally cracked. He reminded his father that the decree had been written precisely because Philip feared a future monarch might allow love, guilt, or pressure to reshape ceremonial rules that were meant to outlast any one marriage. Charles felt the accusation land hard. He had spent years fighting for Camilla's acceptance, and now his own son seemed willing to separate her from the most important public moments of his reign. The king told William that loyalty to the crown should not require cruelty to family. The future king answered that loyalty meant very little if every difficult rule disappeared the moment it became personally painful. William then disclosed what he had learned from the documented review attached to the decree. Philip had not completed the final version alone. Another senior royal had been present during the last examination of its wording, and that person had been formally named as a witness to the review. That mattered because the document could no longer be dismissed as an isolated private instruction, preserved without anyone understanding its purpose. Charles demanded the name. William gave it without hesitation: Princess Anne. The prince explained that Anne had already confirmed in a private recorded account that Philip understood exactly how the restriction could affect Charles and Camilla. He had known it might cause anger. He had known it might divide the family. And he had signed off on it anyway. Charles rose immediately and demanded to see his sister. But Anne was already prepared. She was not coming with sympathy alone. She was bringing something Philip had written by hand, and it would make the decree even harder for Charles to escape. Princess Anne did not enter the dispute to comfort anyone. She entered carrying the one thing Charles desperately wanted not to see: proof that Philip's decree had been built to survive resistance. Her loyalty to her brother remained unquestioned, but so did her loyalty to the standards their father believed protected the crown. As Charles listened, anger slowly gave way to something more dangerous: powerlessness. Anne placed a handwritten cover note beside the typed decree and waited. The document did not allow Philip to rule from beyond the grave. Instead, it worked through internal ceremonial rules he had helped shape, and which later officials had preserved for the narrow state occasions already under dispute. Those rules mattered because they governed who could alter the formal order around the sovereign. Charles recognized his father's handwriting almost immediately. Before his sister finished explaining, the king turned the page face down. Charles asked who now had the authority to change what Philip had left behind. Anne answered carefully. The officials responsible for maintaining state protocol could review the arrangement, but any serious exception would require a formal reconsideration rather than a quiet instruction from the monarch. A formal review meant the restriction would no longer remain a family wound hidden behind closed doors. It would become an institutional fight, forcing advisors and senior royals to examine whether personal loyalty justified changing an established ceremonial boundary. Anne watched her brother struggle with that reality. She told him she understood exactly why the instruction hurt, but ignoring it would create a rule more dangerous than the decree itself. Every difficult royal standard could become optional whenever it collided with someone the sovereign loved. Charles stared at her and finally said what had been building inside him. She was asking him to choose Philip over Camilla. The princess did not accept that framing. Instead, she turned the handwritten note back toward him and pointed to a specific instruction recorded during Philip's final review. The decree had to be shown personally to the reigning sovereign before any exception was even considered. Anne knew this because her own recorded account of that review had preserved the exchange. Their father wanted the future monarch to understand the restriction before anyone around him softened its meaning. Charles finally read the last sentence. Philip had anticipated resistance from inside his own family. He had written that the greatest threat to the boundary would not be weakness in the wording, but emotional loyalty strong enough to make the sovereign believe he deserved an exception. Anne left him with those words. Then another document arrived. Charles opened the revised program for the approaching state ceremony and saw the consequence before anyone needed to explain it. Camilla's name was gone. The argument had moved from paper to reality. And when she saw that program for herself, Philip's decree would no longer feel like history. It would feel like exclusion. There are moments when power is felt not through a speech, but through an absence. Camilla found hers in a printed program. Where her name had once appeared beside Charles for the approaching state ceremony, there was now an empty space and a revised order of attendance. She stared at the page longer than anyone expected. Then she asked the question everyone in the room had been avoiding. Camilla folded the program once and looked toward her private secretary. The changes had already moved beyond one page. Palace staff were revising processions, seating plans, schedules, and attendance instructions for every state function covered by Philip's restriction. Her charitable visits and ordinary public duties remained untouched. But these ceremonies carried a different weight because they showed who stood closest to sovereign authority. She asked whether Charles had approved the change. The reply came quietly. The king was informed. The queen consort felt the words cut deeper than a simple yes. Being criticized by strangers was something she had learned to endure, but this felt different. When Charles later found her alone, she told him exactly why. She could survive headlines, whispers, and public judgment. What she could not easily accept was being removed by his own family after years spent proving that she belonged beside him. To her, one missing name seemed to erase decades of acceptance in a single afternoon. Charles listened without interrupting, and anger returned almost immediately. The king considered issuing a direct instruction to restore her place before the ceremony. He knew what that would mean. William would see it as a rejection of the boundary he had defended, while Anne would view it as an attempt to bypass the formal review. One command could turn a private dispute into an open family split, yet doing nothing felt equally cruel. Then the handwritten cover note arrived in full. Charles read beyond the lines Anne had already discussed and found one sentence she had not read aloud. Philip had written that the restriction was also meant to protect the sovereign from being forced to defend a disputed ceremonial expansion created through personal pressure. The meaning was brutal. His father had not only been guarding protocol, he had been trying to prevent a future king from becoming trapped in exactly this argument. The monarch lowered the page and thought of Camilla, sitting alone with the revised program. Restoring her name might feel like victory for one evening, but it could turn every future appearance into another public test of whether he had bent the crown for love. For the first time, Charles wondered whether fighting the decree would protect her at all. He had spent hours searching for a way to defeat his father's decision. Now he began considering something far harder, accepting it. The turning point did not come from lawyers, courtiers, or constitutional experts. It came when Charles and Camilla were finally left alone. No aides stood nearby. No family member could interrupt. Between them sat the decree that had caused days of anger, humiliation, and division. Charles was prepared to fight one final time. Instead, Camilla said something that completely changed the direction of the crisis. Charles told her he could still reopen the protocol if she wanted him to. The king now understood what that would mean. A formal review, a full examination of the ceremonial rules, and almost certainly a public argument over whether he was changing royal boundaries for the woman he loved. Camilla understood the danger too. If he forced her inclusion through sovereign authority, every future appearance could be judged not for what she did, but for whether her husband had rewritten the rules to place her there. Camilla studied him quietly before answering. She told Charles not to turn their marriage into a constitutional battle, merely to prove his devotion. The queen consort had already endured the pain of seeing her name removed, but she could see something worse ahead. If he fought the decree openly, William and Anne would be pushed into opposition, and Philip's old warning would become a national dispute instead of a private family wound. Charles admitted what he had barely been able to say aloud. Accepting his father's instruction felt like failing her. For years he had fought to make her place beside him unquestioned, and now surrendering even one part of that place felt like stepping backward. Camilla refused to let him carry that guilt. She told him his support did not have to be proven by putting her name on every state program. Then she disclosed something she had kept to herself. Camilla said she had long suspected Philip never fully accepted an expanded ceremonial role for her, based on private conversations and the way he had resisted earlier changes. She had simply never known that he had turned those doubts into a written restriction designed to survive him. That knowledge still hurt. But now she understood the scale of what Charles would have to break in order to overturn it. The queen consort made the decision before he could. She would comply. Charles looked at her for a long moment, then agreed. The choice ended the private fight, but it could not contain the consequences. Their decision was about to become public, and neither of them could control the meaning others would attach to her absence. What had been settled quietly between husband and wife would soon be judged loudly by everyone else, when one missing place at a state occasion turned a private wound into a public spectacle. The public did not need to read Philip's decree to understand that something extraordinary had happened. They only needed to see the state ceremony begin without Camilla. The absence was immediate, unmistakable, and impossible to explain away. Within minutes, broadcasters shifted their coverage, newspaper editors tore apart prepared front pages, and crowds outside the palace began asking the same question: why was the king standing without her? Charles knew the cameras would notice before a single explanation could settle the mood. The palace released a short statement confirming that Camilla would continue her normal royal and charitable duties while observing an established protocol covering specific state functions. That protocol meant the formal rules governing participation in the crown's highest official ceremonies. The distinction mattered because she was not disappearing from public life, yet her absence from these occasions carried far greater symbolic weight. The king paused when an aide adjusted the program before he took his place. He said nothing and moved forward. William and Anne followed the revised arrangement without hesitation, presenting a united front around the decision. Charles deliberately avoided criticizing Philip in public, because turning the crisis into an attack on his father would deepen the family split and make the decree look like a personal war instead of an inherited restriction. Camilla watched the opening coverage privately and felt the consequence settle in. She was sad, but the anger that had defined the earlier days had faded. The queen consort also felt relief. Charles had not torn the family apart to restore her place, and William had not been forced into an open public confrontation with his father. What hurt her personally had, at least for the moment, prevented something larger from breaking. Then the story exploded the following morning. A major London newspaper carried a stark front page showing Charles standing alone beneath the headline, "Philip's Final Line." The image became the symbol of the entire crisis. One broadcaster went further, framing the moment not as Camilla's defeat, but as something far rarer, a monarch accepting a painful inherited boundary rather than using personal authority to erase it. Charles heard that interpretation and understood how quickly the meaning had changed. What began as humiliation was now being judged as a test of restraint. But one decision remained. The king could preserve Philip's decree permanently, accepting the restriction as part of the ceremonial order, or he could reopen the question after the public attention faded and attempt to remove it. The world had delivered its judgment on the spectacle. The final verdict still belonged to Charles, and his next choice would reveal whether this crisis had broken him or clarified what kind of king he intended to be. Charles began this crisis devastated by what he believed Philip's decree was taking away from him. He ended it understanding what his father had been trying to preserve. The final choice was painful but clear. He would not destroy the restriction. He would not publicly condemn Philip, and he would not force Camilla into a ceremonial position now burdened by conflict. Instead, he chose a harder form of loyalty. Charles formally accepted the decree's application to the limited class of state events it covered. That decision ended the internal fight over whether Camilla would attend those ceremonies, while leaving the rest of her royal life untouched. The king confirmed that her charitable work, public duties, private standing, and place beside him within the family would continue. The restriction would remain ceremonial, not personal. That distinction mattered because it allowed the monarchy to preserve its boundary without turning her into an exile. The king signed the internal acknowledgement and kept the pen in his hand for several seconds. Anne stood nearby, waiting without pressing him. Charles finally looked at his sister and said their father had won an argument he was no longer alive to hear. She did not celebrate. The princess understood that this was not victory in any ordinary sense. Philip's decision had forced his children to accept pain in the name of continuity, and nobody had escaped untouched. Charles later told Camilla that the decision was final. The queen consort listened quietly, then answered without bitterness. Standing beside someone, she reminded him, did not always require standing in the same procession. The words softened something between them. He had feared that accepting the decree would feel like abandoning her. Instead, her response made clear that their marriage could survive a ceremonial boundary without allowing that boundary to define their loyalty to one another. William approached his father afterward, expecting anger. The prince had defended the restriction from the beginning, and he knew how deeply that had wounded Charles. But the king surprised him. He said that defending an institution sometimes meant accepting limits that hurt the very people holding its highest positions. The future king understood the lesson immediately. Authority was not only about having the power to change something. Sometimes it meant choosing not to. Philip's secret decree had become far more than a restriction on Camilla. It forced Charles to separate private devotion from constitutional responsibility, while she protected her dignity by refusing to let her status become the battlefield that destroyed father, son, and family. The crisis did not end with Camilla defeated or Charles triumphant. It ended with sacrifice. William and Anne preserved continuity without turning the dispute into revenge. The king preserved his marriage without rewriting the boundary, and the queen consort kept her place without demanding every symbol of power. There was nowhere else for the story to go. Charles had made his choice, Camilla had accepted hers. Philip's decree stood, and the crown moved forward, carrying both the wound and the lesson it left behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.